Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be talking about the 5.6 banners, in which we of course have Escoffier, Navia, Kinich, and then Raiden? Question mark, in which she's most likely here because there's going to be an Inazuma Chronicled wish if I were to guess, and they obviously can't put the Archon into it. Anyways, we're going to be diving into all of the characters and breaking down how valuable they are to pull for your account, as well as talk about the weapon banners and if you should prioritize the character's constellations or their weapon. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Shout out to all my lovely channel members, your support is greatly appreciated, and with that, let's begin. So in terms of what the banner order is going to be, we don't actually know yet. We just know who the characters are. If I were to guess, like with the Furina and Dream situation, I doubt they're going to have the exact same banner twice. So what I think is most likely is that we're going to have an Escoffier Kinich banner on the first half and Raiden with Navia on the second half together. That would just make the most sense to me. So let's go ahead and start with discussing Escoffier. Even without going over the rest of the characters, it's pretty plain to see that Escoffier is just going to be the most overall valuable to pull for most accounts, unless you are lacking a strong damage dealer due to the fact that Escoffier is an off-field sub DPS, which usually leads to longer shelf life. In terms of what she does, she's a cryo sub DPS that is also a potent TMI healer, and is able to shred cryo and hydro resistances by 55%, if they're the only element on your team. There are two extremely potent cores that can be built up with this, and if a character you like can be built with either of these, then Escoffier is a really recommended pickup. The cores in question being Escoffier, Shenhe, Furina, which is the best in slot for all the cryo DPS currently. So if you main Ayaka, Wriothesley, or Ganyu, it's just the best way to play them, and I'd really recommend picking up Escoffier in this case. The second core is double Hydra with Escoffier, which benefits the mono Hydra damage dealers the most, and even though it's worse than using Shenhe for Wriothesley or Ayaka, it's something you can do that isn't far behind, and can be better in Wriothesley's case. Then for the Hydra DPS, especially for Ayato or Yelan on the field, again Escoffier is really recommended. There's been talks about whether or not you should pull Escoffier for Navia, and I'm going to reiterate what I said in my first video on her, which is just a no. Navia constellations and weapons are a much better vertical investment path, and if you already have those, then Escoffier does even less for you. Outside of Cryo and Hydra teams, there's still some other things you can do with her, which will shine, like using her on reverse melt teams or burn melt teams as an off-field damage dealer, and she can be a good general cryo flex slot for hypercarries like Wanderer if that's something you value. But in general, if you're using her for purposes outside of freeze, she can quite easily be replaced or side graded without losing much, so her value is mostly going to be tied into how much she can improve your Hydra or cryo damage dealers. Also, if you plan to go for Skirk, there's a 99% chance she's going to be her best teammate, so I can also give a recommendation in that case as well. Next, let's talk about Kinich. I don't really like talking about DPS units value because it's kind of just, do you like this character and do you lack a strong DPS? If so, pull. Otherwise, don't pull. From Kinich's release until now, he's gotten a lot more interesting, however, as his team options have opened up a lot, and he's become a lot more accessible. His team options on release used to be Bennett, Emily, and then good luck from there. Toma was fine and comfy, but he didn't offer much of an offensive impact, but thankfully Kinich's raw damage was enough to where it didn't really matter that much. And Xiangling was just a pain in the ass to use, and also forced longer rotations, on top of her energy problems making her basically just a pyro applicator, but thankfully his teammate diversity is better now. For starters, he now actually has better pyro options in the form of either pyro main character or Movuika, and he's no longer really tied to Bennett for his top performance. With Eonson's release, he's able to side grade Bennett at low constellations, and at higher constellations she just becomes more preferred due to her stronger buffing and freeing you from circle impact. Or if you want to, you could just double up and use both Bennett and Eonson, which is by far his best single target teams if you have Emily. Speaking of Emily, she is still quite an important character to Kinich teams, so it is somewhat harder to recommend Kinich if you don't have her. So if you are a Kinich main, I'd try to save up for her upcoming banner whenever that happens. So yeah, Kinich now has a multitude of top tier options within the burning archetype, making him one of the more flexible Natlan options, and he is in general a DPS that can handle pretty much all types of content, so if you're lacking a carry and can reasonably get or build his teams, I'd recommend picking him up. Do note that he has some flaws as a carry, mainly being that his damage if you don't know what you're doing can feel very single targety, and that since he flies around in the air and most of his teams don't use a shielder, you can be very prone to getting fly swatted out of the air and comboed, though these issues can be fixed if you just learn how to play him better. And honestly, Toma's still a great option for Kinich, so having to use him isn't that much of a downside. Umbrella Warfare, I guess? So Navia's having her second rerun, in which the biggest thing that has changed for her is the release of Shilonen, who has just become her de facto best in slot Geo support over someone like Chiori or Kachina. And there are also Movuika Navia teams too, although it's not necessarily a buff to her, it's about as good as her Furina teams. Speaking of which, there are two ways to build up your Navia teams. You can either go down the hypercarry route, which is the best way to play her, utilizing Bennett, a Geo support of your choice, and then a flexible support in your last slot. These teams end up being Navia's best teams, and besides wanting Bennett, gives you a good amount amount of flexibility for enemy matchups and element checks, as you can fit in a lot of different characters to fill in her last slots. And because someone like Kinich is free, you do have a good starting point to build Navia teams relatively easily. So this is the archetype I'd recommend if you're playing Navia, in which the best variants of this team are still very competitive with other top tier damage dealers. If you don't want to use Bennett, however, you can slot in another Furina healer, or you have the option of playing Navia's plunge teams, which are still quite good. You want to use Shan Yun, of course, Geo support of choice, in which Shilunin and Kuchina are the best options for this girl set, although Gora and Shiori still work fine. And then your last slot can either be Eonton or Furina. In this team, you just cycle between plunging and using Navia skills, so it feels very intuitive, and is still strong enough to meet the current Abyss DPS checks. So again, like with Kinich, if you're missing a strong DPS or like Navia's playstyle and have the units to build her teams, go ahead and pull. In terms of flaws, Navia doesn't have the best AoE, and you don't run groupers with her, so lining up enemies can be a pain in the ass. And I guess her single target damage nowadays doesn't match most of the more recent carries we've been getting, although in actual gameplay, Navia's front-loaded nature isn't reflected the best as it is on cheats. So don't worry, she's still more than enough to clear comfortably. And I guess the last flaw for Navia would be that her vertical investment is kind of bad, which we'll talk about more when we get to the weapon banner section, so let's move on. Now, the last character to talk about is going to be Raiden. It hasn't been that long since her last rerun in 5.0, but I do want to say that I think now Raiden is kind of not that great of a pull. Her value has really plummeted since characters like Chlorine keep getting better and Veressa just released, both of which can utilize the same teammates and archetypes as Raiden, but just better, besides a team like Double Hydra, I guess. And if you also look at the roster of DPS units that have been released since Raiden's last rerun, so many of them have just been fucking nuts numbers wise. So if you're looking for a DPS to carry you with big numbers, Raiden currently wouldn't be my pick, but she's still a very comfortable niche driver for Double Hydra or some Chevreuse teams. Raiden's main upside of being an Omni battery really hasn't moved. It's just that she hasn't currently been given any new strong burst DPS to drive, and even the Double Hydra team that I like using with Raiden, when Escoffier releases, she's going to be a buff to that team. So any Cryo or Hydra DPS will be able to play the archetype a bit better. Ultimately, I think we've gone to a point in time where unless you plan to vertically invest, most of Raiden's strengths don't really hold up anymore. There are characters that have better front-loaded damage, there are other Electro DPS that can just utilize their teammates better, and for her driver playstyle, the characters that were on it are just finding much better use elsewhere. And it sucks because Raiden is one of my favorite characters, but besides a few niche cases, I don't think she's holding up the best. But that's it for the yap session on the characters. To conclude, Escoffier is going to be the highest value most of the time, especially if you have Cryo or Hydro characters that use her well or plan to pull Skirk. You should always pick her up in that case. And then from there, I do think Kinich is a better DPS than Navia, and he's less Bennett reliant. So if you have the units to build his teams, I'd rank him above Navia. And then lastly, there's Raiden, who I think is going to be in dead last. And now with that out of the way, let's discuss the weapon banner and the vertical investment paths. Leading with Escoffier, there's honestly a good argument you can make for both her weapon and Constellations. Her weapon is the first support to 5-star polearm, and it's a very good attack stat stick to Escoffier herself, which is good for her personal damage, though at the same time it also gives a 36% attack buff to anyone Escoffier heals. Escoffier, funnily enough, doesn't really get the full utilization of the passive because her healing lasts for 9 seconds, and the weapon passive lasts for 3 seconds, so you only get 12 seconds of uptime on it. It's still a very good weapon for her team-wide, don't worry. Also, both Ayaka and Gon use burst snapshot, so there's even less of a downside for those teams. For Escoffier herself, it's a very nice personal damage increase over her other weapon options, as there aren't really that many 4-star or standard 5-star options that are great for her, and if you care about Escoffier's personal damage, then her weapon tends to be a bigger damage increase over getting her C1, which gives 60% cryo crit damage. In terms of buffing, that is where her C1 is slightly better than her weapon, but even then I would still recommend getting her weapon because of the discrepancy in the personal damage. So unless you have a good enough alternative like Homa, then her weapon is generally going to be the better pickup over her C1. For Kinich, assuming you're going from Earthshaker, his weapon is better than his C1, so unless you have a high refined Serpent Spine, that is what I'd recommend picking up. Next, let's talk about Geo Kinich, in which her Constellations are ass. Unless you're playing some kind of quick swap skill DPS Navia team, her C1 doesn't really do anything, as you have very good Geo batteries that can be run with Navia that already give her relatively low energy requirements. And because of team constraints, the burst cooldown reduction doesn't really do anything, and going to Navia C2 is only slightly better than getting her weapon, so just get her weapon or invest in other characters' constellations like Shilunin's, Chiori's, or Furina's. And to wrap things up, for Raiden, I would prioritize her constellations and trying to get her C2, as it is a much bigger damage increase than anything else you can get, on top of the fact that her C1 is still a decent damage increase comparable to getting a better weapon for her, and the catch can more than serve you enough, so just prioritize her constellations. But with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment who you're pulling for in 5.6, as I'd love to hear and respond to almost every single comment. Thank you so much, channel members, for all your continued support. It means the world to me. I would give all of you hugs. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.